Okay, so it's been a couple of weeks since I've done one of these. Gotten quite a bit done. I had a little bit of a side trip. Where did I go? Did I go to Texas? I went to Texas recently, but I went to California to go climb Mount Shasta, which is a beautiful volcano on the north end of the Central Valley. And a few friends of mine, we went up there, spent a few days going to the top. It was a really, really tough climb, but I'm glad I did it and would love to do it again sometime. Definitely kicked my butt though. It was hard, harder than I expected. Anyway, while I was out there traveling, a bunch of my parts came in and I had a chance to hammer out some sort of long-standing wiring holdups, and I chased down some of the sort of remaining little odds and ends with the panel. I got some of my fuel line, actually all of my fuel lines completed, including the manifold, and then I'm working on stuff with the tail that's, I've run into an issue that we'll talk about, but this is the latest. Definitely slowed down on progress because it's little things, but hopefully in the next couple weeks we'll get the engine started, and I'm working on that as a goal for the time being. So here we go. Okay, we'll spend a sec talking about my landing lights. Kitfox does have an option for wingtip landing lights, landing taxi lights. Aero LEDs makes them. I did not want that option because I had a bunch of these Baja Designs lights and from my truck that was lit on fire, and I figured I would use them. They're a lot brighter than the Aero LEDs, and I just had seen the wingtip lights and wasn't super stoked about it. We'll talk about a few advantages to using the Kitfox provided or Kitfox option Aero LEDs, but I'll just look at the ones that I got for the meantime. So they're Squadron Pros that I just bolted to the top of the gear gas strut bolt, and then I just scavenged the landing light wiring that was in the pre-wire kit and pulled it back through the wing, cut the end off, and just put power and ground to these things. These don't have like an onboard basic circuit or relay that allows them to wigwag. There is something that I'm going to think about in the future to program that with this little single board computer to get a wigwag function, but for now I'm totally okay with it just being on and off. But they're really bright. The provided breaker was 5 amps. I ended up replacing that out with a 10 amp breaker. And then after I did that, I put, there's an inline fuse. That's it. That's the only, there's no fuse protection beyond the breaker. But if you're using the 5 amp breaker, these I think pull 7 amps at full power. So you need something more than 5. Every time I was turning it off, it would just blow the breaker within seconds. But replace that out, super bright, mounted in place. And I popped the wiring through the same hole that I popped the brakes through and just wired it up with the existing landing light wirings that came with the pre-wire kit. So super happy with those. They look pretty awesome and are ridiculously bright. So that's one thing checked off the list and get out of the way. So yeah, the landing light is rigged up to be wired with the standard panel landing light, which is right here. It runs just fine. The only thing that's now not functional is my wigwag function here, which I'm not going to get into, but I'm going to just wire up a simple little, not like an Arduino microcontroller to run a wigwag function. But either way, it's all set up. I want to talk about the basic configuration for the G3X. I couldn't really find the manual online. I kept finding the installation manual for the old G3X, but I couldn't find like the configuration manual. But I heard that it was a pretty simple push button setup, so I guess I could just demonstrate how this works. It's really easy. You basically hold the menu button when you power everything on, and it will take you into the, basically, if you hold it long enough, you'll see an option here in a second. Wait for it. Okay, it says configuration mode up at the top there. Once it goes into configuration mode, it takes you into this menu, and you can just tab through each one. I didn't have the engine basically reading, and I wasn't sure how to set that up, but if you go into, let's see, is it LRUs? No, engine and airframe. So, is this right? Yeah. So for example, like the EGT, I don't think there's a CHT on this. maybe there is, but the EGTs, cancel. There's an option for basically a Rotax FADEC, because this is a Rotax 912IS. The flight computer basically takes all those, not the flight computer, what do you call that? The ECU, engine control unit, which is behind the panel here. It takes all those inputs and feeds it as a single FADEC stream to the G3X. So it's like super easy to go through, and you know, for exhaust gas temps, I could set up my maxes and my mins. I don't know what they are. I have to look up all that stuff. But for now, I basically have all the sensors that I needed set up, including this fuel flow sensor, which I had to buy specifically on Aircraft Spruce. But otherwise, like your RPM, we don't have fuel gauges in this bad boy, but coolant temp, elevator, trim, which I have a whole nother, we'll have to talk about, and then like volts, and all that type of stuff. So you can pretty easily tab through these menus and get this display to set up. Once that's on, if you turn the lanes on, none of these are actually gonna read, but once you give it start power, everything's gonna come live. If you can see on the end there, oh, whoops, cancel. Those no longer have red X's on, and you know, your oil temp is reading ambient temperature, which is about 80 degrees. That's pretty good. Fuel pressure, 39, that seems a little high, but could be wrong. Yeah, then, you know, this is the first time I actually gave the aircraft start power to see that those sensors, this is the first time I've actually seen these sensors come live, which was pretty exciting. And then, you know, you can verify that the fuel pumps are hooked up by listening closely. Yeah, see, probably not good to run them dry, but either way, there goes the power for the engine. There goes all the, you know, indications. But that's the configuration menu. This basically takes you through setting up everything, like electronic stability control for the autopilot. You can set up sound, set up your aircraft tail number, what type of image it shows, configuring your transponder, your autopilot, the AOA, all that stuff is set up in this menu. I didn't fully understand that. There's another way, there's like another configuration menu that you can get into by holding down, I don't remember which one of these buttons, and that was wrong, but once I figured that out, we just get into this one and it's a piece of cake. So this is set up and ready for like taking it outside and calibrating everything, which is super exciting. I don't think I have anything else to plug into it, other than like my trim, which I have to do after I upholster this center console. I actually have the trim. The trim's been hooked up and tested and everything, the trim buttons and stuff like that, but I don't want to lock it in place until I upholster this, because it's going to be a real pain to undo everything at the end of that process. So anyway, that's electronics, looking pretty sweet. All right, I'm going to try and get a good view of this behind panel setup. I finally mounted all the panel. I tightened all the bolts, and then also got these little aluminum tabs put in, and then everything that goes onto the aluminum tabs is permanently mounted in place. So that was a really tough process for me. I ended up having to move things around a couple times, and there's, you know, like an extra hole there. There's actually like, I think 3 or 4 extra holes that I didn't want. At the end of the day, it's not the big deal. It's maybe saving a little bit of weight. Just kidding. But I got these all in a happy place that I want them. So the way I have it set up is I've got my backup battery here, the little inline fuse box, or whatever they call this thing right here. It's riveted in place to that, to this tab. I have basically 3 places that this is physically mounted with 8L clamps. The only thing they actually call for is for that side to be mounted with 8L clamps with the ECU, and they say double-sided tape is good enough. I didn't like the double-sided tape idea, and I'm glad I didn't use it so that I could pull this stuff in and out, but I just used an 8L clamp there, an 8L clamp there, and then one in there with the oil cooler, which I'll zoom into. But one of the consideration of fitting all this stuff is you have to actually, I called that an oil cooler. I meant to say cabin heater. There's a cabin heater right there, and that, which you can see the top of it right there, is has to go onto that tab. I actually mounted that differently than the manual calls for. Yeah, here's your ECU that I mounted slightly different than how the manual calls for to fit that oil cooler on the other side, but it's in place. This one is, the ECU has to be physically like tab mounted to the, or a 8L clamp mounted to the actual frame. So there's a bolt that shares an 8L clamp there. And then these are all just bolted right into the aluminum, and then, you know, 8L clamp holding it in place there, and then one right in there. That's 3 holding this whole tab in place. And then I stuck little pieces of foam underneath right there to keep it from wobbling when, or rattling when it's in flight. But here's the oil cooler. It's easier to see. Oh God, oil cooler. Cabin heater. It's easier to see from this side. You have to fit it in with this guy. So, man, this is so tight. I can't even see. See how, like, it has to fit in between the ECU and they basically has to shiv in between there. I didn't mount it how they called for in the manual. I put these, gosh, I can't even do this. Can't hold this. Okay, I did not mount this how it was called for in the manual. I made these tabs. This is the actual material that they use to typically rivet into the cooler. But I made these tabs, and I screwed one end of the angle into the cabin heater, and then the other one I bolted into the actual aluminum plate there. So that's on both sides, but that's how this I mounted. I just felt like that was a much easier, sort of less intrusive way of doing it, because if I put it on the what do you call that? I riveted to that angle there. I wouldn't have had enough exposure with the angle to actually get a bolt through. So that just gave me a bit more of a mounting surface to work with, and it's super solid. I mean, really, really solid. And then once you get that together, you have to basically splice wires together and get this plugged in with the pre-wire kit. And then you actually have to put a fuse in there. I kept turning it on. I'm like, what the heck, was my wiring wrong? I redid the wiring, and then I realized that it needed an inline fuse that's in this box. So I popped that in there and turned on. First try, once that was connected. The hose comes basically on both sides just to the firewall right there, and then tees off the radiator lines right there. Little gotcha before I pull this seat pan out. When I marked up my seat pan, I didn't consider that there was going to be a seat cushion in there. So at full aft stick, this rubs the seat cushion, and like a little bit. You can basically cram the seat cushion back there really far and not get rub, but it's still going to be pretty tight, and it'll be hard to keep it in place. So this has already been rigged. I might move the stops forward a little bit, but if you move it too far forward, you run the risk of hitting the panel. So I just, early on, wish I considered the seat cushions as well as the seat pan. I just didn't have the seat cushions until recently. Okay, just a few more things to talk about here. First one being the fuel hoses are all in and installed, everything. And so I'll give a rundown of what we got. There's a line running. This is a return line, so we're starting from the very end of the run. This is a check valve that you see it's mounted with 8L clamps here instead of underneath the center console like the manual calls for. And then it runs into there underneath the center console all the way up, and then hits the firewall at its standard port there. So there are 2 hoses here. There's that main, or I guess that short one that goes to here, and then a long one that goes all the way up to the firewall. And then coming out of the firewall are basically the line going from here, it's a 90 and a straight, going into the firewall, and then this really sweet bend that Steve at Aircraft Specialty made that clears underneath these rudder cables, and then also on top of the electrical stuff down there. So that runs back and goes all the way to the oil or header tank right here. And then of course on the front end we've got our main port coming out of the firewall, going down into the oil pump or fuel pumps, out of the fuel pump into the fuel manifold, which Steve made for me, which is pretty sweet. There's a 180-degree bend, and then there's a port going into the fuel manifold, fuel coming out of the manifold across. It still needs to be zip tied down into the right-hand side fuel rail or input, and then goes through the engine, obviously, and the return, here's the return rail, comes out right there, goes back into the firewall there, and then we all saw the rest of the run. So this entire fuel setup is now for sale at Aircraft Specialty, which is Steve. He's out of Wisconsin. He has all these measurements and everything set up, including this 180-degree mandrel bent or special CNC bent manifold piece, which is called for in the manual. Doing it yourself is almost impossible unless you have the right dies. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe you have the right mandrel bender, but you can't do it with pretty much standard hand bending tools. Maybe, I mean, that tight of a bend would be very challenging. You'd have to sort of bow it out. So all these are pressure tested and solid stainless steel fittings. And this firewall forward are integral fuel sleeving, and then firewall aft has like a static discharge through it. And then he's got that special, drop 90 bend for the fuel shutoff switch, and then all the other lengths are standardized, and he has them there. So if you wanted to get that whole kit, he's been selling fuel hose kits, or just hose kits in general, for a while now. And he had one for the 915 IS firewall forward, but he now has a firewall back. The only thing it doesn't have is basically the hoses that come out of the fuel tank, which are included with the kit. So this is much more robust than the aluminum easy bend tubing that they send you. It's much cleaner bends, less likely to restrict flow with tighter bends, and it also is a non-solid connection with the firewall that allows vibration. So basically the hoses from the center console to the firewall are allowed to flex, and if you put rigid tubing in there, there's a possibility of fatigue over a long time. So they're apparently rated for 10 years, which is the life of the engine basically, and it's pressure tested, leak tested, all that jazz. So we worked together to get the lengths right so that other people, if they wanted to get the kit for the 912 IS, would work right out of the box. You could get the rest of it firewall back, and it's pretty much standard. That fuel return line, I don't know if the carbureted motors have, but for the 915 he has already the firewall forward, and the firewall aft for the 915 is the same as the 912. So those kits are awesome and available. If anybody was interested in buying them, call up Steve. I'll put a link to his website in this video somewhere in the bottom. I should also mention that Steve does do custom built hoses and tubing. He's got this fancy CNC machine. I'll put a link to the video. I think it's a private link, so I'll put it down in the bottom so that you can watch it. But he's got this really cool CNC bender and is really good at making this type of stuff. So he makes stuff for, he and his partner make stuff for the RV aircraft and I don't know if it's the Highlanders or the RAN series or something like that, but they've got a lot of experience and it shows. I mean, these are really, really, really high quality parts. Again, you can definitely get away with the stuff provided in the kit. The easy bend aluminum works fine. I'm sure people have many years of success with those stock parts, but I just like the peace of mind of having a really bomber fuel system, with the integral fire sleeves and the solid fittings and really good pressure tested connections. And then the stainless hose in the back also was a nice plus. I guess I can talk about my brake system that I've run. This is still kind of a work in progress, and at some point in time I'm going to work with Steve at Aircraft Specialty to get a much better kit put together, because the one I have is kind of a Frankenstein setup that's going to work, but it's not exactly what I want it to be. So we'll just give a brief rundown of what that looks like. Okay, so starting backwards, I've got a little pigtail here, stainless, running from a 90 from the brake caliper. Lauren clocked his brakes up high, so it runs straight, maybe that way. I don't know how he did it, but he clocked his differently so that it comes out of the port differently. I just put a 90 on there, which is not stock, that I had to buy, and then ran up to this is a NICOP solid, I don't know, 24-inch line or something that runs up to the port on the bottom of the fuselage, which we'll get to. But this I'm mounting with these little connections and an 8L clamp. I've been advised to use something else. I've also been advised not to put it on the front. So at some point in time I might swing this around and put it on the back to get it out of the airflow, but still debating that, because if it goes in here, then that means it gets subject to getting kicked anytime somebody gets in and out. So I'm debating that one, but it's more likely than not gonna get swung basically 180 degrees around the tubing to be pointing backwards. So following the routing further, there's a little short pigtail here, and this is a NICOP little piece that's poking out of the bottom of the fuselage. So let's see if I can get a better shot of that. Sorry, it's dark down here, but that's a NICOP fitting that's poking out just enough to attach this. Then again, the NICOP that's poking out is held in place by one of those clamps and an A-dowel to the bottom of the fuselage. It's got this bent section here so that it loops around and it runs inboard underneath all this wiring and attaches to the parking brake to a straight fitting right there. And this is actually something I'm gonna have to address, because if this comes, like if the rudder pedals, which I don't wanna get into, rudder pedals are pissing me off right now, but if the rudder pedal, whatever they call this thing, gets bent all the way back, then it kind of, you can see it kind of makes contact there. But so that's something I will address down the road. That's the brake line. Same thing on the right hand side. That's basically the line from the parking brake all the way to the brakes. From there, I've shown this before, but stainless lines from Earl's Speedflex of fixed measurements running across and then all the way up to the valve, or the, what do you call this, reservoir, master reservoir up on top. And that's same on the co-pilot side. Yeah, so still work in progress. Eventually I'll either publish these measurements or get Steve to do something a little more solid that's custom lengths, because these are off. Some of them are off by like an inch or two, and I'm gonna have to come to terms with that eventually. In general though, the brake lines, if you ask around, those little Teflon lines that people use typically that's provided with the kit, I have heard now a few times that they leak, or they have leaks, or they break open. I've had stainless braided lines and hard aluminum tubing break on our 210 when we were landing, which is, you know, you're able to land the plane because you don't really need brakes that much. But in a pinch, you need your brakes. So that's why I'm making sure I have as much hard line as possible. That's just reduced stretch in the actual line run. And then also I feel like hard line is just by definition a lot more durable. It's hard, robust. So I've got that NICOP hard line run, and then the hard line run down the gear leg. And then you have to use stainless connections to get to the fuselage because there's bend there. And then also to the brake caliper because it does wiggle a little bit and you don't want a solid connection there. So the stainless stuff's super robust. It's basically the same tubing as that standard PTFE or Teflon tubing, whatever they call it. It's just got a stainless wrap around it and much more robust, solid stainless fittings instead of those brass fittings that are provided. Forgot to mention this is a little USB port. It's a Garmin GSB 15 or something like that that mounts really nicely in this headset jack plate that Kitfox makes. And you just take the accessory power ground lines. For some reason the backlight doesn't work with these power ground. I might be missing something. They should glow, but it doesn't. And once you put that in there, in this little fuse box, it says pilot accessory down there. You just have to put a 5 amp fuse in and she's good to go. Okay, so one thing I'm holding off on is this elevator trim. The actual whatever transistor is mounted, resistor, whatever, variable resistor, whatever they call this thing, and the wiring surrounding, but this little tab, there are no instructions with this that I could find. So this tab goes there, and as the trim flies up and down, this basically depresses that tab. I had to trim this side of it down pretty substantially. That was even because it basically can't make contact with the center mount of the elevator. I guess this is where the main horizontal stabilizer mounts. So I think I'm gonna just glue that in place. There's no instructions, but I'm gonna get this thing fully rigged up before I actually glue that, because I don't wanna have it glued in the wrong place and then have to move it. Well, obviously I fixed the issue I was having with the tail light. Wow, I just looked at it and I can't see anything. Whew. These are really bright. May not show in the video, but I mean, you can't look at that without being blinded. I'll show you the two connections that I used that made this a bit easier. Okay, so the first thing is that I used this. This is what they include with the kit, and this I bought a second one because I had to scrap. This is a little Molex 4-pin. Let's see if I can get it to show up in there. This is a little Molex 4-pin. You need 4 pins. This one's, I think, for like, I don't know, for 22, like 16 to 22 gauge or something like that. So these little guys, I bought a second one that I was like, okay, I'll just replace the one in the kit. You have to have something small because it has to fit in that little hole where the rudder pokes into. The one that I liked better was this Molex 4-pin, which is just a lot smaller and fits in that slot a lot better. It's also easier to work with. This one, I just feel like it's kind of janky, and once you get the Molex pins in there, they kind of just like wobble around, but this I had a lot better luck with. So that's one thing that helped me out. I just ended up chopping the connection at the light because there was a short in there and rewiring it. The main problem I had was that you have to basically ground to the shielding. That's a 3-lead wire, and the 4th lead you have is a 4-lead connector or 4-lead plug. That 4th lead or 4th main line you have is the actual shielding of the wire. And you have, I mean, you can solder it on. I tried to solder it on myself, but this is what I ended up using. I got these from Stein Air. It's called a solder sleeve. This has an actual ground connected to it. See if that helps. This is a, they're like 20 cents a piece or something like that. But you see that little red ring in the middle is actually a piece of solder, and you heat it just with a heat gun. And these are like glue, like a rubber glue that shrinks down. That soldering shrinks down and binds everything to the outer shielding. And then that ground lead will basically complete a ground on the, oh, here comes some rain. It'll complete a ground on the actual shielding. And this way you don't have to solder it. And this is actually watertight and sealed and everything because of the, oop, get into focus there, because of these rubber connections on the end. So rudder light works, but of course I ran into another problem. I was worried about this because I think Brian Bowen had mentioned that this was a problem. Early on in the manual, they say to make sure that, they say to file, they don't say to add anything, they say to file your rudder stops to make sure that you have, I think, 30 degrees of motion. They gave some number, and I can go look it up, but I'm not going to. And that is to make sure that the rudder moves far enough so you have enough control. That is not the issue here. The issue is that the rudder stops, from the fact I didn't touch mine. I was going to file them after I set everything up, but I just measured to make sure it was 30 degrees, and it was actually more than 30 degrees. And I said, okay, we'll just see if I need to take some off when I put everything together, then I'll just file them down. That's an easy task. Of course, it's never that easy. These make contact with the freaking elevator. So if you put full rudder deflection in, either right or left, the elevator will bind. You can see that. And I don't want to scratch my paint, even though I've done that a little bit. But that's contact with the elevator. And I'm not going to crack this thing open right now to show you how that works, but there's this metal tab that comes out of the back of the fuselage. And then there's these 2 tabs on the rudder, and as the rudder turns, it runs into those tabs. Well, those tabs aren't long enough. So maybe this would work without the speedster tail option because there's some extra bulk there. I read on the forums, this is actually a known issue, at least since 2019. That's when it was posted on the forum. But this means I'm going to have to weld on an extension to the rudder stops. Now that this is covered, I'm not going to uncover this. Another thing that people do is they tap a hole and put stop screws in, or put a stop nut and a screw in, and that makes it an adjustable rudder stop, and you could like reach in there with a screwdriver and adjust it. That would be probably the most ideal scenario. I haven't seen any pictures of that. I just understand the concept of what's going on there, but that's too late for that. I never thought that I would be, I would have thought that the stops would be too long from the factory. As they mention in the manual, they say, they might be too long, so you have to file them down. So this is the first time my elevator stabilizer and rudder have all been on the, basically all the tail surfaces have been on the plane ever. I mean, never have I had them all on at once. And I should have test fit this all long before cover. It wasn't on the pre-cover checklist. Doesn't mean it, you know, I shouldn't have done it. But this is definitely something that should be handled really early on, because even before powder coat, because I'm gonna have to grind powder coat off, weld. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna weld a bead onto the end of those little metal tabs that are sticking out, so that I get, you know, a half inch of, not a half inch, I'll probably get a 1/4 inch of material. And then if that's, I'll have to put the thing back on. And if it's not enough, I'll weld another bead on top of that. All right, I don't wanna be a negative Nancy. Still, you know, I'm still positive about the whole thing. It just, that put me in a bit of a bad mood, because that's a big undertaking that is a design flaw. I'm sorry, I don't want to say it. I mean, I can't avoid saying it. This is a legitimate design flaw that I'm gonna have to undo. And it's a known design flaw that's been around for 3 years, which really bothers me, but whatever. The world knows. The cat's out of the bag, you know? Cat's out of the bag. Don't make this mistake that I did. Check it before you cover, and you're probably gonna have to weld, or at least drill some stop screws in there. I haven't called the factory to see what their solution is, but I might see if I can get Brandon on the phone and see if he can walk me through. He's always super helpful with this type of stuff, because he knows his stuff. So I'm trying to get maybe Brandon on the phone and see if I can solve this problem, but it definitely cannot remain with contacting my elevator. Okay, one last thing I'll say here. I had said in a previous video that I've begun oversizing all of my holes to 13/16. Now you could get I'll probably say the number not wrong, but either number 12 or number 20 reamer, whatever is the next size up from the 0.1875 or 3/16 inch reamer. If you get a drill size chart, you can find whatever that is. I can't remember it off the top of my head. So you can oversize with the reamer, or you can oversize with the 13/64 drill bit. Let me double check that. Yeah, this guy's my new best friend. I have confirmed, it's 13/64. It's 1/64 larger than 3/16. Because AN hardware can range a little bit, slightly larger than 3/16, at least the AN-3. I have had a lot of luck oversizing all of my holes with this. There's no excess play or anything, but the difference between not doing this and trying to put that elevator horizontal stabilizer on, and then after doing this and trying to put them on, is 2 hours. I know that sounds like an overstatement. Unless you have 2 people here, you're spending a lot of time trying to get nuts and bolts through, because it's at tolerance, and some of the bolts, if you put a caliper on them, are just slightly over 3/16. So the reamer is not sufficient to get you enough clearance. And yes, there's probably a little bit of play, but this was all done with just a jig, and you can tell it's not built to like a really, really tight spec. So the idea that you're gonna have perfectly spec'd holes is just delusional. And I came to that conclusion with the brackets for the flaperons, and I'm applying that philosophy across the plane, at least with all the chromoly stuff. You know, chromoly doesn't fatigue quite like aluminum does. Sorry, that's not aluminum, stainless. So the stainless and the chromoly stuff, I'm just oversizing right off the bat with this, and couldn't be happier with it. Wish I did it for everything else. All right, well, I think that's it for now. I've got a lot of work cut out for me. This rudder shenanigans is just one of the silly things that you're like, oh yeah, I got this rudder done, you know? All I gotta do is throw it on, swage the cables, and then we're good to go. But this is, I guess, the reality of the kit building is nothing's ever that straightforward. So no matter, you know, this has got me down today. Definitely put me in a downer mood. But if I reflect on like the last week, I've gotten a lot of really awesome stuff done, and made some really good discoveries. Like those solder sleeves have really helped my whole wiring experience. And I got pretty much everything plugged in. I mean, ELT is it. So like the next steps after this, I think I might just wait on this and just walk away from it for a few days so I don't become infuriated again. But in the meantime, I'm gonna work on the oil system. Steve at Aircraft Specialty is doing the same thing that we did with fuel lines, we're going to do that with oil lines. So we have integral fire sleeve oil lines. I say lines, I actually mean hose, but it'll be integral fire sleeve hose kit measured to length with all the right fittings and clockings and stuff. It'll be a kit for the 912 IS from basically this standard configuration. So that's what I'm going to work on now, just to get away from this nightmare. And yeah, trucking along. Once that goes on, I'm firing it up. No questions asked. We're putting some Swift fuel in there, and I'm turning the key because everything's wired and ready to run. So I'm super excited about that. It's taken a lot longer because I haven't really been putting the time in, but when that engine goes on for the first time, it's going to be phenomenal. So yeah, shout out to Steve for being such an awesome help. Really bright guy. Also Nick, I don't know if you watch these, but if you do, you're a champion. This wiring kit is literally legendary, and you are a super awesome, supportive dude that's really helped me get all this stuff done. So I really appreciate the work that he's done to get this pre-wired panel together, and then also the support that he actually gives to make sure that it's right. So I've said this before, I still feel that this pre-wired kit is the best thing I've ever bought from Kitfox, hands down, and would definitely buy it again. Not cheap, but totally worth it. So, all right, that's all for now. These videos take me forever to do and edit because I'm really slow at video editing, but hopefully by the next one, which is maybe in the next couple weeks, it'll be an engine start, which I hope you guys are as excited as I am, because that's a big momentous moment. And then after that, I feel like there are a lot of these little things I got to chase down, but that I'm going to feel like I'm over the hump and really we're cooking with gas. No pun intended. So talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching.